Tonight's lecture will cover the last sermon of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 24 through 25. And then we will look at the death and resurrection of Jesus in 26, 27, and 28. This is how the last section of Matthew is divided up. This sermon that Jesus preaches, chapter 24 and 25, is the climax of the entire Gospel of Matthew, where he ends on this apocalyptic flourish. Then in chapter 26 through 27, Matthew narrates Jesus' death. And finally, in chapter 28, he narrates the resurrection of Jesus. Now, fear the apocalypse. Matthew's real interesting when he constructs his sermon for Jesus, basically because he expands Mark's little apocalypse. Mark chapter 13 is his primary source, but he also uses material from Q, and he culminates with material that is unique to Matthew. There's two large sections of this sermon that are found nowhere else except for Matthew. So this is where he's using material that is uniquely his, or this is his own voice coming through. Either way, this is important because it gives us a stronger idea of what Matthew believes and what his theology may be. But it is certainly clear that this passage, this entire sermon, is an apocalyptic sermon dealing with end time and final judgment. So let's look at how Matthew constructs this sermon for Jesus to conclude the Gospel of Matthew. So as you can see here, Jesus has the destruction of the temple foretold, signs of the end of the age, persecutions foretold, the desolation, sacrilege, the coming of the Son of Man, and the lesson of the fig tree. This entire section, chapter 24, verses 1 through 2, all the way to 24, verses 32 through 35, come directly from Mark's little apocalypse. They call it a little apocalypse because in Mark, this is a one chapter devoted entirely to Jesus' teaching about end times. So you'll see that chapter 24, 1 through chapter 24, verse 35, follows Mark almost exclusively. And you'll see that Luke also uses this section of Mark's gospel when he writes his gospel. So it's an important section throughout Mark. So it would be good for you now to pause this video and actually read through all these passages. Read through 24, 1 through 35 in Matthew, and then look at Mark as well. Mark 13, 1 through 38, and then you'll be able to see exactly how Matthew expands on Mark's little apocalypse. So go ahead and pause the video and take some time to read through those. Now that you're back, we're going to look at how Matthew uses the Q material. We just saw that the chapter 24, verses 1 through 35 comes exclusively from Mark's little apocalypse in chapter 13. Now Matthew does something different. He totally takes Mark off the table and includes Q material, which is also found in Luke. The necessity of watchfulness. This is again following Mark's little apocalypse. He follows that with a story about apocalypticism, or the end of time, and being ready. Then goes straight into faithful and unfaithful slave or servant. Now, as soon as he goes through using this material from Q, which is found also in Luke, he breaks with Q and does something that is unique to him. So Matthew 25, 1 through 13 is unique to the Gospel of Matthew. And then he comes into the parable of the talents. I'll just flip to another slide real quick just to show you the last chapter of Jesus' sermon, chapter 25. It is material completely unique to Matthew. Then he uses Q material, and then he ends with more material that is completely unique to Matthew. So if you look back, it's Q, Matthew, Q, Matthew. The sheep and the goats parable comes after verse 30 and goes through 31 through 44, I think. So you'll see Q, Matthew. And so that's how the last sermon of Jesus is structured in the Gospel of Matthew, using the entire section of Mark. So you have a long section of Mark, then two sections from Q, unique to Matthew, a section of Q, and unique to Matthew. So take some time now. Pause the video and read through these sections here in Matthew 24, and then look at how that's redone and how Luke uses that in his gospel. Compare and contrast those two, and then come back to Matthew and read these sections that are unique to him, 25, 1 through 13, and which I don't have here. It's on the next slide. 25, 31 through 30. So go ahead and pause that, do some homework on this Matthew text, and look at Luke as well. All right, now that you're back, we'll continue to move through this video looking at the bridesmaid. You just read through this material, and you saw how Matthew uses this cube material differently than Luke. But it's framed in this bridesmaid, remain watching, keep your eyes open, don't get lazy, basically. Followed by, in the meantime, while you're waiting, you have to be a good steward. This is really important through Matthew because it's speaking directly to his community who is finding themselves in a very difficult situation because they are ostracized from their own Jewish community. And Jews in Antioch are ostracized from the Greco-Roman community. So he's doubly ostracized here. And he's not denying that Jesus' return is going to happen. He's actually claiming that it will, but he doesn't know when it will. So in the meantime, they have to be vigilant and take care of the things that they've been entrusted. Because, and this is the final flourish of Matthew, because there will be a judgment. And the separation of the sheep and the goats is really important for Matthew. This is the final section of Jesus' final sermon in the Gospel of Matthew. This is what Matthew's community in Antioch is left with. After all these 5 sermons, this is the last, most profound section. So he starts with the Sermon on the Mount, 5 through 7. He has a missionary sermon in chapter 10. He has the central sermon in chapter 13. He has the transition sermon in chapter 18. And now this is the grand finale, the final sermon of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. And he ends with this, the separation of the sheep and goats, where all nations, and that word can also be translated Gentiles, because it is often, but all nations, all people will be gathered before the king, according to this parable. And that king will separate the sheep on one side and the goats on the other side. The sheep will be told, when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me water. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was an alien, you welcomed me. When I was sick, you visited me. And then the sheep will respond, when did we see you this way, master? And the king will reply, when you did it to the least of these brothers and sisters, you did it to me. So this is when the sheep who have done everything right and done what they were supposed to by basically taking care of the most vulnerable in society, they are given eternal bliss, eternal peace. The goats, on the other hand, are given just the opposite because they did not take care of the most vulnerable. So this ultimate separation between good and bad on an eternal level, on the final judgment scene, is based on how the community treats the most vulnerable. Now, this is striking because this community is absolutely considers itself among the most vulnerable in society. So it's basically a way to say, hey, we're going to be taken care of. God's going to take care of us. And those who treat us the way we need to be treated, God will take care of them too. So this final judgment scene is certainly an ethical call to taking care of the most vulnerable, but it's also a judgment to those who don't. And that certainly functions to take care of Matthew's community. But it is a very apocalyptic passage that can't be denied. And so Jesus ends with it. Jesus' last sermon, the last section of the sermon, ends with this apocalyptic flourish about eternal destruction and eternal bliss, which leads directly to Jesus' crucifixion. I just wanted to give you a couple of icons here. The one on the left, this one is from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. It's very early. This is their language. It goes from right to left, like Hebrew, called Ge'ez, and it's a depiction of the crucifixion scene. This is probably the most famous piece of sculpture in the world, really. It's the Pietà, where Mary's holding Jesus' lifeless body. This is Michelangelo's work. That's one piece of granite. It's at the Vatican City in Rome on public display. Anybody can go see it, but it's an incredible piece of art. And then up above is a relief from a church in Europe where they are taking Jesus' body off the cross. And all these scenes come from the Gospels that were written 2,000 years ago. And so as Matthew transitions from Jesus' last sermon into Jesus' last days and narrating his crucifixion, he follows Mark's account with some important variations. Mark's death scene is at the end of his Gospel, chapter 15 of Mark, 14 and 15. And the main variations outside of expanding Mark, the things that are unique to Matthew, are Judas's suicide in 27, 3 through 10. That's not found in any other Gospels. It's not found in Mark, Luke, or John. It's actually the only other narration of Judas's death is actually found in the Acts of the Apostles, which we'll talk about a little bit. The other thing that's unique to Matthew is Pilate's hand washing. And this absolutely serves Matthew's purposes. Matthew throughout is struggling to create an identity for his community who are Jewish law-observant followers of Jesus. And these Jews who follow Jesus are at odds with the Jewish leaders of their time, specifically in Antioch. And so Matthew's story of Pilate washing his hands really is a harsh criticism of the religious leaders, not of Jesus' day as much as the critique of the religious leaders in Matthew's own day. Because it's absent in Mark, we know that this is totally unique to Matthew and serves his purposes to really kind of curse the Jewish religious leaders who may have been antagonistic to Matthew's community there in Antioch. And then the final section of Jesus' death that is unique to Matthew is the raising of the dead in 27. Just these short 2 verses that are seem bizarre, but are a little bit more comprehensible when you put them into context there in Matthew's account. So let's look at some of these unique sections. Judas' suicide. The way Matthew narrates it in 27, 3 through 10, he uses several Old Testament texts. So if you have a study Bible, like a HarperCollins study Bible, like I recommended you get, or an Oxford annotated study Bible, you can look at those footnotes on this passage, and that in those footnotes it'll give you all the Old Testament texts that are coming into play here. So Matthew's weaving these texts from the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, to narrate Judas's suicide, to show him his departure from not just life, but the rest of the disciples. But it's pretty fascinating to see how this story is narrated in Acts. Again, Luke Acts is written by the author of the Gospel of Luke. He wrote both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. So this narration, this non-suicide account of Judas's death, is fairly interesting compared to Matthew's description of the Judas's death. So I'll go ahead and pause that and go read Acts. It's really quick verse. Read Matthew and see how these are two totally different accounts of this death of Judas. And what this will obviously show is just like the birth narratives. It shows how Matthew and Luke are really different, fundamentally different on a couple of things. And Judas's suicide is one of them. In Acts, it's not a suicide at all. So go ahead and pause the video, go to those texts, and read how differently they are. If you have a HarperCollins or Oxford Annotated Study Bible, read the footnotes to Matthew 27 and look up those Old Testament texts. So I'm going to give you time to pause it and read these two accounts independently. All right, now that you're back and you read that, I hope you've gotten a clear picture of Matthew's difference in Luke, and it certainly serves his purposes to show Judas in this light. But let's go on to something else that's unique to Matthew. Some people think it's from Mark 15:15, but if it is, Matthew expands this one verse into several verses, a whole story, in fact. I want you to think about the implication for Matthew's own community when Pilate, a Roman official, and Rome is certainly no friend to Matthew. He has a very ambivalent relationship to Gentiles in general, but Romans in particular. But to have Pilate, who was a pretty terrible Roman governor of Palestine, wash his hands of Jesus' death, does a couple of things. It shows that Jesus' death, for Matthew, he's putting the onus on the religious leaders of his own time, and he's demonizing them in some profound ways. So I want you to read Warren Carter's chapter here on Pilate, pages 145 through 168. These are on our e-learning site. Carter does a great job explaining Pilate and Pilate's role in the Gospel of Matthew and how Pilate represents Rome. So go ahead and pause this. This is going to take you a while to read these 13 pages, which is fine. Pause this video, read Warren Carter's section on Pilate, and then go back and read the story of Pilate's hand washing in the Gospel of Matthew. All right, welcome back. I know that probably took longer than you anticipated, but you can see how Carter constructs Pilate and gives you a much deeper background about Pilate's life. Let's move on to this really unique passage to Matthew chapter 27, 51b through 53. It is very obscure. It only happens here in Matthew but the dead rising really just heightens the significance of Jesus' death. Jesus' death is so significant that all these miraculous events happen. So spend some time reading this passage. You don't have to pause the video right now, but go back and read this section and see how unique it is to Matthew. After the description of Jesus' death in Matthew 27, we move to the resurrection story. And here are just some depictions of the resurrection. Here, the Sistine Chapel. This is the top of St. Peter's Basilica, both in Vatican City. Another medieval depiction of the resurrection. So Jesus' resurrection in the Gospel of Matthew follows Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. But with some major differences. So look at, in just a second, we'll look at the difference between Matthew's story of the resurrection, which is found in Matthew 28, 1 through 10. It departs from Mark with guards at the tomb and their report. This is unique to Matthew, these two sections about the guards being at the tomb and then their report, but it also serves Matthew's purposes. What also is unique is here at the end, Matthew 28:16 through 20, this commissioning of the disciples. This does not exist in Mark or Luke. This is unique to Matthew. The Gospel of Luke doesn't have to have this because the Gospel of Luke has a second book called the Acts of the Apostles. It really details the things that happened in the early Jesus movement immediately following Jesus' resurrection. Here in Matthew doesn't have that. So this ends the entire Gospel of Matthew with this really commissioning section from Jesus. But let's look at some of the major differences in Matthew's resurrection story. And you will need your Bible for this. I'm going to outline it, and at the end of this slide, we're going to take some time for you to read these sections on your own and see the difference. The main differences between Matthew's resurrection and Mark's resurrection is that in Matthew, there's an angel of the Lord there. In Mark, there's just a young man. In Matthew, there's an earthquake and the angel rolled the stone away. In Mark, when the women arrived at the tomb, the stone had already been rolled away. There's no angel, there's no earthquake. In Matthew, the angel's appearance, you'll see that it's similar but different than the young man's appearance. It's more miraculous, more glorious in a lot of ways. Matthew 28:4, there are guards at the tomb. Mark, this is just not in Mark. There are no guards in Mark. There's a message from the angel. Look at these messages and see how similar and different they are. In Matthew, unlike Mark, the women ran to tell this story that they had witnessed. The women in Mark run away afraid and tell no one. So that's fundamentally different. And then, which is totally absent in Mark, this original ending of Mark 16:1 through 8, does not have a resurrection appearance of Jesus. Jesus makes no appearance in Mark in that original ending 1 through 8. And Matthew certainly corrects that problem by having a Jesus appearance in verses 9 through 10. So go ahead, get your Bible out, look at the different, read Mark 1, chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. You will notice that most Bibles have a footnote there saying that that is the original ending of Mark, which is most likely what Matthew had. If Matthew had Mark 9 through 20, he certainly would have made use for it, but he does not have that extended ending of Mark. So read Mark, read Matthew, and see how they differ from each other. Go ahead and pause the video and take some time to do that. All right, welcome back. We'll move on to the guards at the tomb. This is unique material to Matthew. It's in two sections, 27, 26 through 66, and 28, 11 through 15. This was a defense against the charge that Jesus' body was stolen. Apparently, Jesus' followers proclaimed that Jesus had been resurrected from the dead. Their enemies, people who didn't like them, said that that wasn't the case. Somebody just stole his body. So Matthew knows of this issue, and he includes this story to explain both the rumors that his body was stolen and the evidence of the resurrection. And I say evidence because this is just literary material that Matthew's using to combat this concept. So it functions, again, to demonize Jewish authorities, which serves Matthew's community there in Antioch more than anything else. Matthew really doesn't like Jewish authorities and is really using this to show how bad they are and how they spread rumors about the Jesus community. So you can see how Matthew is doubly isolated within the larger Jewish context. These Jesus believers are certainly ostracized, and from the Greco-Roman world, they never really fit there in the first place. So we'll finally come to this last section, the commissioning the disciples. This is again unique to Matthew. This is how the gospel ends. And it highlights prominent themes in Matthew, these Matthean themes. He talks about the Gentiles or the nations, this ethne, going to them and baptizing all of them. So there is here clear intent that the Jesus movement moves towards Gentiles, but nowhere in Matthew does it look like there's a forsaking of Jewish tradition to do so. There's also an impetus on teaching and obedience in Matthew 28:20. These are constant themes throughout the gospel. And the gospel ends kind of where it begins in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, just not long after the genealogy. We get this passage that Jesus would be called Emmanuel, God with us. That's picked right up in the last verse of Matthew, where Jesus says, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of time." So this idea that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us, and God will be with us forever, is how Matthew ends his gospel. So it's worth going back, looking at this short section of Matthew 28:16 through 20, to see how Matthew ends his gospel. I hope you've really enjoyed reading through the Gospel of Matthew. I hope these videos have been helpful for you. Next week, rather than having a video lecture, there will just be a video to watch that outlines through scholars' perspectives the way Jesus' story was written in the Gospels and kind of the history of his life. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me and get in touch with me. And if there's nothing else, I hope this class has been helpful for you. Be well.